He was paid to hide a baby Bigfoot. When the mother showed up, he disappeared. That's the kind of headline that gets printed in bold and passed around with coffee cups. It makes a tidy story. A man, money, a secret, a dramatic vanishing. It makes people lean in. I know because I read a version of it once, stapled to a county fair flyer and folded into the back pocket of someone who thought it might make for a few good jokes. The line is true in a way that matters, but not the way the headline implies. I wasn't paid in cash to shut my mouth. I was paid in ways that don't show up on bank statements, in promises, in favors, in meals, in people turning their heads the right way when my name came up. And when the mother came back into our life, what disappeared wasn't me walking away. What disappeared was my place as Scout's everyday guardian. My job, the small, stubborn stewardship that had become the center of my days, it left, as if it had never been mine to begin with. I remember the morning the flyer showed up like it was a physical thing, like a paper plane that landed on my stoop with a fold and a crease. It was October 2005. The air had that brittle edge to it, the kind that tells you winter is waiting beyond a few cold nights. I was making coffee stiffer than usual, the kind that holds up its own bitterness, when Emma called from the kitchen. She'd been living with me for a couple of years, helping with the house and the shop, and smiling when I complained about the weather. She held the paper up between her fingers like it was a thing that might bite. "Look at this," she said. The flyer had a glossy photo of men in boots and field jackets and a headline about an expedition sponsored by a private cryptozoology outfit. Dr. Harrison Webb's name was on it, listed as the lead. They'd booked the old Beech Grove Inn for a week's run in the National Forest. The flyer listed dates and a road map that ended boldly at the county line near my property. They were offering to pay for anyone with useful information. They wanted to meet anyone who had reliable sightings. I folded it back once and set it on the table. There are some papers you tuck away because they might mean trouble, and some you fold up because they are trouble, folded into a small, neat shape. I made coffee anyway. Sunlight slanted through the window and made a strip of light on the floorboards where the dog used to sleep. There was a tightness in my chest the size of a walnut. I'd been guarding a secret for 10 years. 10 years is a long time to be careful about what you let into your life. The barn had rules. The loft had rules. People had rules about where they could stand and when they could come up the ladder and what they should not ask. I'd sworn a couple of promises along the way. Not written promises, no contracts. Promises between two people who knew enough to see what the other had kept. That was the currency of it. Trust, favors, and favors owed.
So when I say paid, that's where it starts and ends. There were offers later, people knocking around with wallets and smiles who thought a secret could be bought. But the real thing that settled us, Emma and me and Scout, into this pattern was far older than money. It was the small barter of lives. I gave him cleaning and shelter, a box of old toys, and the sound of the radio. He gave me mornings that weren't hollow, nights that weren't empty, a heartbeat that matched mine in the small hours. That's a kind of payment I can't add up with a pencil. If this is the sort of thing you lean in for, the sort you want more of, then stay with me. If you like hearing from folks who were there instead of reading someone else's reworded rumor, go ahead and subscribe. I'm not a showman. I tell it the way I remember it. The flyer made us move through the house like shadows. Emma and I walked the property line that afternoon, the way we used to walk it when Scout was small and noisy and we were testing him on how to step over a fallen log. The forest edge looked the same, birches turning yellow at the tips, the creek holding its own gray reflection, but a new feeling lived behind the trees now, like a hand waiting to close a door. I had kept things small for a long time. No strangers beyond the mailbox, no cameras stuck to trees, no notes left on the front step. Video, I'd told myself, was the devil's sugar. Once it's out, it finds a mouth and never forgets the taste. We walked toward the barn, and I thought about the first time I heard that small, high sound that night in April of '95. I remember the exact date because I carved it on the top rung of the loft ladder that summer, April 18th, 1995. The ladder was mahogany smooth in the places my hands had worn, splintered where my tools had slipped. I'd been working late that week on a bed frame, the kind of thing folks in town come to you for when they want something that doesn't wobble. I left my truck lights on that night and locked the shop door. The radio was set to a station that played old country and the very faint hiss of static like a neighbor you've known too long. At about 10 past midnight, I heard a sound coming from the north side of the shop, a rustle that didn't belong to a raccoon and wasn't the soft, heavy tread of deer. It was a thin, keening noise, higher than a wolf and lower than a baby's cry. I walked out slow, the cool spring air like a hand on the back of my neck. My dog, a mutt named Gus, was gone a year by then, but the yard had its memories, and sometimes I could feel them like a pulse under the dirt. There was a light over the old well, and the ground beyond it was churned with prints, not just deer hooves, but something broader and flatter, like a boot with toes. I thought maybe someone had left an animal trap set and an unlucky creature had wandered into it. People set traps for coyotes and wait for the sound of an animal thrashing.
I should have gone back in the house, I suppose. I should have called someone. Instead, I grabbed a flashlight, tacked my jacket tight, and walked toward the sound. It led me to the edge of the creek, where the willows hang close, and the cold holds the moonlight. There was a small bundle of fur under the low branches, curled up like someone had rolled up a child in a blanket. He was about the size of a boxer puppy, maybe a toddler if you squinted, with a forehead packed with that dark, almost blue-black fur, and eyes too bright for the dark. One forearm had a rash of scratches on it, and he made that keening sound again when he saw me. He didn't bolt. He watched me, with a look that, even then, I recognized as being entirely present, a curiosity and a distrust and a need all mixed tight. I picked him up because there was no other thing to do. He was lighter than I thought, and the bones of his hands were big, the fingers wide and blunt like the ends of my hammers. The fur was soft between my fingers and smelled like wet moss. He tucked his head into my neck the way a baby tries to find the pulse that's regular and safe. When I carried him back toward the shop, my hands trembled without any great drama. I just had the thought, plain and domestic, that you don't leave a child on a creek bank. There's a basic decency to that. That first night, I made him a bed in an old milk crate lined with blankets and set it in the loft, where the wind couldn't get at him. I'd cut a hole in the barn board years earlier to fit a small window, and through that window you could see the town like a smudge of oil lights. He slept that night with his hand flat on my wrist. He was quiet except for the soft sucking noises like someone trying to find their breath. I don't know what I expected. A monster, a threat, something to be afraid of? What I got was a raw, tender thing that looked to me with a kind of question I knew how to answer. Do you have room? Do you have food? Do you keep your promises? You start small with something like that. You give it milk, and you make a plan that you tell no one. I sterilized a baby bottle with vodka and water because that's what the internet of the mid-90s taught the boys in the hardware store. I say internet like it was a church then, a strange new church where men traded how-tos and recipes for survival. I fed him small amounts, and then more as he took to it. He learned to suck a bottle like it was a skill he'd been taught in another life. He learned to swallow without choking. He learned to grip my finger and hold on when things were loud. Emma came around a year later. I met her at the feed store when she bought a bag of seed and asked about a hammer I had leaning against the counter. She smiled like someone who knew the cost of things and was willing to pay it. She'd been married once, long before she came to stay with me, and she liked my bad jokes and the way the wood smelled in my shop. She was practical and had a way of saying the right thing at the right time without making it a production. She climbed that loft ladder like she'd been doing it her whole life, and when she saw Scout, that's the name we gave him because he was always watching like a lookout, she laughed a belly laugh that filled the rafters. Scout grew fast in the way children do when they are not slowed by clinic visits and pediatric charts, but by long days in the loft and the rhythm you can only learn by living with someone. By summer 1997, he could stand on his own, and then he could walk. He took to the shop in the afternoons, sitting on a bale of hay while I worked, handing me bolts and nails like he understood purpose. His hands were enormous even then, and he learned how to hold a rasp the way a human learns. He could pass a plane over a board and smooth it as if he had been shaping wood for years. He loved the hiss of a bandsaw and would press his ear to the guard to hear the motor hum. Mostly, he liked the radio. He liked the hum of the human world more than the quiet of the trees. He learned enough words to make a conversation, and then a few more words to make jokes. People who have known me long will tell you I'm not good at showing off. I'm a man of small demonstrations. The way I showed Scout things was cluttered. I'd knock a tool on the floor to demonstrate what not to do, and he'd watch and then try to do the opposite. He had a face that could rearrange itself into laughter at the oddest things. Once he put a hat on Gus's old statue by the gate and then sat next to it and started to whistle. We both watched his lips make the note, and I remember thinking that I'd been paid tenfold for that day alone. We kept a rhythm. Mornings were for the shop and evenings for the loft. He helped me split kindling, and he learned to make a pot of beans without burning them to the bottom of the pan. I taught him how to mend a fence, how to measure twice and cut once. He taught me how to listen again, not to the radio, but to small sounds, the ones that happen when things are safe. Emma taught him to read, little blocks with letters on them, and he took to 'em like someone who had missed school and then returned and found it was all right. There were moments, small and private, when I would find him perched on the loft railing reading the picture book by the light from the kitchen below, and my chest would fold in on itself with something I couldn't name, but which I felt steady as a nail. As he grew, people in town started to notice odd things. A trail of sap on a fence post, a tree where branches had been shaved in a jagged pattern, footprints that didn't belong to any of our usual animals. Once, someone found a bundle of cloth on the edge of the county road and took it to the sheriff. We ducked those questions. We practiced answers like we were rehearsing for a small private theater. Maybe some kids left it. Maybe a deer rubbed against it.
For a long moment, I saw only the outline, broad shoulders, a curve where I knew a hip would be, a motion like someone kneeling to test the ground. Then light caught it, and I saw the fur the same midnight blue as Scout's, the mottled gray where time had brushed her, and a face turned toward me with eyes I could feel like a number. Emma moved closer to the barn with a blanket over her shoulders. Scout was behind her, his head down, like he was trying not to let a conversation start before he knew the words. The creature didn't call at first. She made a sound like a wind through reeds, a long, low vocalization that had no human syllables but filled the space between us as clear as a word. It was not a sound I could write down. It was more like the memory of a sound. The thing held itself tall and breathed out slow, and the smell of the forest seemed to ride on the breath, damp leaves, a sweetness of pine and earth. We both just froze. That's the honest truth. My hands wanted to reach out, and my stomach wanted to pull me back. I heard my own heart like a small drum in my teeth. For a long minute, maybe longer, we watched one another. Then the creature stepped forward into the clearing, and I realized she was bigger than I had imagined.
Mother, I thought, before my brain even consented to the word. She had a ragged scar along one shoulder, and her hands were calloused and wide like Scout's, but with a softness that said she had held infants and built nests and had been tending to the world in a way I never understood. She looked at Scout and then at me, and in that look something happened in my chest that I have not found a better word for than permission. It was as if she read the ledger of the years in my face and folded it shut. She looked at the loft and then at my hands, and for the first time in a decade I felt my duties rearrange themselves like chairs being moved in a living room. I felt the ledger slide over to a side of the desk that made it small and private and not mine to spend anymore. Scout walked forward then, like a child walking to a parent, and he flung his arms around her waist, and she let him. The sound they made together was something I had not heard before, not a human cry, but a chorus of relief and confusion, and the same raw gladness I had felt the first night I took him in. I stepped back without meaning to, as if the floor beneath me had been pulled away by a tide. The air smelled of damp earth and old kinship. I had raised him in the secretive ways of our house. She had known him in the ways of the forest. For a second there were two worlds in the clearing, and they overlapped like palms pressed together. When people talk about a thing like this, they look for a moment of bargaining, an offer of cash, a plea for anonymity, a shaking of hands with someone who promises discretion. That's not what happened. She didn't speak in our language, and I did not speak in hers.
She looked at me with something like gratitude, and then with an intensity that cut like a knife. It was not a look of accusation, it was a look of recognition, the kind of look one gives a person who has done what needed to be done. "She's back," Emma said, in a voice that was hushed as a lit match. Scout stepped back and wiped his face on his sleeve, like it was something he'd been taught not to do in front of company. He held his mother's hand, and she cupped his face like the river cupping a stone. For a moment, I was a man who had been holding a secret, and the secret took its shape, unfolded, and showed me what I had done. I had been raising someone's child. "What now?" Emma asked. It was a practical question, and the right one, and we all knew no one could answer it with a single sentence. The mother, Sage, as Scout would later name her to me with a word that meant something like shelter in his tongue, moved her head slowly and looked at the barn and then at the trees like someone selecting a home. For an hour we stood there and did not speak much at all. She showed Scout a small gesture, and he mirrored it. He imitated the way she touched a notch on a tree and then touched the same notch on the barn post. It was like watching two people reading the same book in different languages. When she finally turned to leave, because she had to do that, she had her own world, she paused and looked at me. I thought for a sliver of a second she would say something I could understand. She didn't. Instead, she placed something small on the ground near the barn step, a smooth stone, about the size of a lemon, rubbed glossy by whatever hands had carried it. She set it down and stepped back into the trees. Scout followed her, glancing behind him once. He looked at me, and in his eyes I could see 1,000 kinds of love and 1,000 duties. Then they were gone between the trunks. I stood there a long time. The sound of my breath was the loudest thing I'd heard in ages. When I walked inside, the loft felt different. The ladder looked like an entrance to a room that had been lent to me, not a place owned. The stone sat on the step where she had left it, warm in the afternoon sun. I put it inside my shirt and kept it there for the first night, as if keeping a secret under your heart could keep you from losing it. That was the day my role in Scout's life began to shift. I had thought of myself as his guardian out of necessity, and then out of love.
When Sage came, she did not demand Scout back in the way someone might demand a possession. She reclaimed him in the way a mother remembers the exact shape of her child's nose. My place did not vanish with slamming doors and dramatic exits. It dissolved more quietly into something like a new arrangement. I had been paid, but the payment had nothing to do with money.
It was paid in that moment in the hollow between leaving and coming, in the brightness of the stone on my palm, in the soft certainty that a mother had come for her child. Still, I knew then that the balance of our secret would change. Her arrival was an answer to a dozen questions I had been avoiding, and at the same time it introduced a dozen new ones. How would we share care? What would we do when other eyes came? Would she trust the ladder and the loft? Would she trust that a man who smelled of oil and cedar held no harm in his heart? All of those things were questions that could not be solved by a single look or a single stone. We spent the next week in a kind of truce. Sage came back in the mornings and sometimes in the late afternoons. She ate with us. I learned later that she liked apples rubbed in salt, something my neighbor swore by, but which I had never tried. Scout slept with one foot in the loft and one foot in the trees, the way a person might sleep if their life was balanced between two beds. Emma and I would stand at the gate sometimes and watch them, like two people who had been given a strange inheritance and were trying to figure out the boundaries of it. At night, when the house settled and the radio played low, I would take down the ladder and sit with my hands on my knees and think about the ledger of years. I had spent a decade learning to keep my mouth shut for reasons that felt right. I had spent another decade learning to welcome a creature into my home without thinking about the consequences. And then one morning, with a flyer and a piece of glossy paper in my mailbox and a name on the edge of town, those years compressed like ribs under pressure. The world had a way of reading secrets like scent on a breeze, and I could feel them starting to blow toward us. I stood on the porch that evening and held the stone against my palm. It had warmed to my skin. I couldn't tell you if Scout and Sage would choose to stay nearby or slip away into the deep of the forest. I couldn't tell you whether the man named on the flyer would be a scientist or a showman or both. What I could tell you, and what I would tell anyone who listened, was that love is a form of currency, and sometimes it pays you back more than money ever could. It also, though, made a man fragile in ways he never expected. You can be paid with love, and you can still be threatened by the world that covets what you love. That night I climbed the loft ladder and lay on the floorboards with the moonlight like a strip of silver down the barn. I listened for a sound that would tell me the world had not shifted too far. The barn creaked, the radio downstairs hummed. Outside, the woods held their breath. I had no notion then of all the ways that flyer would change things, no hint of the men with cameras that would one day stand at the edge of the property line, or the strange thin legal letters that would later arrive from county offices. None of that. There was only the stone, warm in my hand, and the sense that a life I'd built on the quiet of small truths might be about to meet a noise that would not leave it whole. I put the stone on my bedside table and tried to sleep. The ladder sighed as it settled, and I listened to the barn floor flex under the weight of secrets. I thought of how easy it had been to take him in, and I thought of how complicated it would be to keep him safe when other people came with cameras and maps and suitcases full of questions. The next morning, the flyer was gone from the table. I don't know whether I threw it away or folded it into a pocket, but it mattered less than the fact that our days had narrowed themselves around a new center. That afternoon, I went down to the field and practiced throwing a bale onto the wagon, because practice is a compass. Emma came with a thermos and sat on the back step and knitted something that would be a hat one of these years. Scout watched the road with a hand to his mouth. He had learned to watch for signs the way a man learns to watch for weather. I thought perhaps he could see the way the light bent at the edge of the pines and knew something was about to happen. When Sage came back a second time, she didn't come alone. She brought with her a younger one who trailed her like a shadow and who watched the humans with a guarded curiosity. It felt to my bones like a small peace offering, as if she was saying, "This is mine, and these are the rules we will try." She did not ask me to leave. She did not tell me I must disappear. She merely held Scout to her and let him breathe against her shoulder, and with that simple act, rearranged everything. I don't pretend it was heroic. I don't pretend I didn't consider leaving on my own terms for the sake of the barn and the quiet. There were nights when I imagined sitting down at the diner and telling the whole truth and letting the chips fall where they may. I imagined the newspapers and the lights and the men in suits. But the thing about a life that's been paid for in favors and gratitude is that it costs more to abandon it than to keep it. I had been paid with Scout's laughter and with nights that had company and with a stone that warmed my hand. Those were not payments I could easily hand back. So I stayed. I kept the loft ladder in place. I kept the radio on low. I kept a fire going in the stove in the mornings. I mended fences. I fixed a wheel on a cart for the woman down the road. I was small and the world was large, and I found myself trying to keep both in place. The flyer still lived in the pocket of my jacket, like a small, flat worry. I put my hand on it sometimes when I walked the yard, just to remind myself the future had a shape. And then, one evening toward the end of October, while the birches had thrown most of their leaves and the creek had gone gray with the cold, a truck pulled into the lot of the Beech Grove Inn.
A man with a tie stepped out, and he had a polite face and a map. That's the moment the world turns from something you can manage with a ladder and blankets into something that comes with signatures. But that was later, and there's a line of things that leads from the stone on my porch to a truck with a map and a man with a tie. The line runs through the soft, private days where Scout and his mother learned the difference between two homes, and through nights where I practiced keeping silence like a craft. For now, though, I stood on the porch and watched the trees and felt my role shift like the weight of a tool being handed off. The headline was true in one respect. I had, in small and strange ways, been paid to hide a baby. I had been paid in trust and food and warmth, and in the knowledge that a life had been kept from a world that might harm it. And when the mother came back, something disappeared. Not me, but the place I held in the center of Scout's day. It was a hollow feeling and a gift in the same breath. I kept the stone on my bedside table and listened that night for the sound of footsteps that would not belong to me. I did not know then what shape the coming days would take. I only knew that a decision had been made without words, that Scout would see both of us, that the woods would remain his and the loft would remain ours, and that the world beyond the trees was starting to look in with very human eyes. The truck that pulled into the Beech Grove Inn had a license plate I remember, because it was the kind of plate that looks like it belongs to someone who never learned the smell of oil in their hands. It was polished and new, and the man who climbed out of it wore a jacket that had never seen rain in a way my coat had. He carried a map rolled under one arm and a polite smile like a business card. He introduced himself as Harrison Webb and said he was there to meet with anyone who had observational data. He had a clipboard and a way of asking questions that made you feel like you could be helpful without meaning to. Dr. Webb came to the diner first, like most of them do. Dinners are where the town deposits its stories and its coffee, and you collect both in equal measure. He bought pie. He bought himself time. He asked about the woods and the creek and whether any of us had seen odd signage, like someone carving a trunks or fresh breaks and branches. He used the words field work and conservation and often smoothed his hands in front of his chest as if to protect something he hadn't named. He never used the word showman. He used the word data. People like him have good manners. They listen, they offer terms and stipends, and they leave you with a business card that gleams with institutional logos. 2 men from his team came the next day with cameras that looked hungry and a warmth in their voices I didn't trust. They asked where people walked and what time fences were checked.
Someone mentioned a man with a ladder up by the old barn. Between the diner and the inn and the feed store, the town filled with a kind of brittle curiosity. When the world points a lens toward your place, everyone has a reason to be looking. The sheriff, Tom Morrison, came by not long after Webb's arrival. Tom's face was the sort that held 1,000 memories and didn't want to add any more. He was careful and private in the way sheriffs in small places must be. He told me, plainly, that he had received calls and that it would be better if I came down to the station for a chat. He didn't use the word warrant then. He asked if I had anything unusual on my property, as if the easiest way to keep a problem from growing was to make it a conversation. I told him what I could without lying, that I'd seen tracks a few times, that my barn was old, that I'd keep my ears open. He thanked me and left his card on my table. The card had a navy stripe and the county seal on it. His signature was quick and certain. Webb's people began setting up at the forest edge. They left little flags along the logging road and hung motion-triggered cameras from low branches. They set up a base tent the way birders set up a blind, with a low, eager hush and the smell of propane. At first, their presence felt like a storm parked just beyond the farm, an annoyance, watchful and distant. Then they found the shelter sites. It was a grad student on their team who called it an occupied site. She had a gentle voice and a way of turning her camera over to me like she wanted me to see what she saw. They'd found a place where brushes had been woven into a crude roof and where a bed of moss had been layered with fur. They found a pattern of burnt stones where someone had kept heat in the shape of a hearth. I looked at the pictures and nodded and felt my mouth grow dry. When someone writes in a notebook the words occupation and habitation in the same column, the law starts paying attention. I did what a man who carries a secret for 10 years does. I began counting. I counted the days since the flyer. I counted the hours of daylight left before winter. I counted tools in the shop. I counted ways to keep a roof from sounding hollow. Emma and I reinforced the loft beam with an extra brace. We started keeping a small bag of dried provisions under the rung of the ladder. Nothing clever. Just the sort of things you do when you know you have to be ready for a short, fierce winter. There were offers, too. Men in suits aren't always as tidy as the man with the map. People came with other currencies. Someone from a private sponsor left a letter with a check torn out, as if the envelope itself had been opened in a hurry. A local businessman offered to clear my bills for a month. A reporter offered me anonymity for a payment to offset inconvenience. Those things came wrapped in a kind of kindness that had a moth's hunger at its middle. I kept the letters in my desk, and the envelope without the check under a nail. I didn't cash the check. I put it back in the envelope and slid it into the place where I kept the owner's manual for the old tractor. I had been paid in small, soft currencies before, meals from neighbors, a winter's worth of salt for the drive, but whether I accepted material kindness or not, the world had sharpened its edges around a secret we were protecting. Dr. Webb visited once more in person, and this time he came to the gate. He wore the same polite face, but his questions were closer, narrower. He asked if he might look around the yard, if he could take prints from the barn threshold, if it would be possible to see any tracks near the creek. He asks with that confident tone that suggests a handshake will follow. I told him I had nothing to show. His smile changed in a fraction of a breath, professionalism finding its edge. "We've filmed something on the ridge," he said, careful and steady. "It's inconclusive, but we have enough to file a request. If there's anything you're worried about, talk to us before the warrant process begins. We'd rather not force a search." There's a peculiar pressure in being offered help that would involve admitting the thing you've kept. I listened to him and felt the old ledger in my chest flip pages the way you let go of bills you can't pay. He might have been trying to act gracious. He might have been trying to be kind. He might have been trying to be pragmatic. I thanked him for the warning and closed the gate. I thought, profoundly and foolishly, that if he had seen something, he'd leave it at that. People who study things sometimes know the etiquette of leaving them be. They did not leave it be. On a gray day in late November, with a wet wind that made the trees lean as if toward confession, the county prosecutor's office faxed a form to Sheriff Morrison. It was thin, bureaucratic, and had a stamp that said, "Probable cause." Somebody's footage had developed traffic on the web, they said. Someone in a far city had uploaded a clip, a shaky thing, filmed from a distance of a large biped moving along a ridge. The clip was grainy, and the camera shook with the human breath behind it. In the dark, it looked for a second like an outline of a person with shoulders too wide and a gait that wasn't quite right. People later would call it a sighting, and it would be replayed with commentary and arrows. But that afternoon, the sheriff got the call, and I felt my mouth close like a trap. Tom came over with the paper and the kind of face that looks for the soft places to tell bad news. He said we could avoid the warrant if I let them come and have a look. He said it would be faster and quieter if we cooperated. He put his hand on the gate and looked at me like a brother might look at a trouble he inherited. I told him the truth I could, that the barn was old, that things were stored, and that the ladder was dangerous in a storm. I told him that I'd always tried to be helpful within reason. He nodded at each answer, and then, finally, said, the way my father used to, "You understand where I have to stand." I understood. So did he. We stood there a long while with our hands in our pockets and the wind worrying the hem of my coat. For a second, small and private, I thought about riding out anywhere, hitching a trailer and going to a place where no one would look. But the truth is, you can't run from something you've signed up for. You can only rearrange your involvement differently. I had a face to the secret that I could not pretend away. We had maybe 12 hours before the team moved in, and things turned the soft edges of negotiation into something sharper. Emma and I made a plan the way you plan a small kitchen remodel. Precise, practical, lacking any dramatic flourish. Emma packed Scout a bag. I tried to make it look like nothing. Scout noticed, as he noticed everything. He came into the kitchen with his hands smelling of oil from working in the shop, and stopped when he saw the small pile of rations. He looked at me, and then at Emma, and then at the ladder, as if he were measuring the distance between two words. "Where are you going?" he asked, in the language he was teaching himself to hold when he was nervous. I sat down at the table across from him. The table was scratched with the scars of many years, dinner rings, a small gouge where a hammer had slipped, a burn mark where I had once left a pot to boil too long. I put my hand over his, which was broad and warm. "Just for a little while," I said. "The woods are busier. You and your ma can go stay where it's deep and quiet." He looked at me like he had understood, or like he had learnt to understand the shape of decisions adults make when they cannot make them simple. He nodded, slow and rigorous. He was not a man yet, but he held himself like a person who understood that sometimes the thing you love is best kept away from the show. That night we reinforced the loft door with planks and a bolt. We put soft straw around the crate and tucked a blanket he liked at the foot of the bed. We wrapped a small pack, dried meat, a flint kit, a few of my shirts that smelled of soap and metal. The act of packing his things felt like packing away a part of myself. I tied a scrap of red cloth around an old whistle and tucked it into the pack. I told myself it was a token of safety, something that might be the echo of my presence. Scout put his hand on my cheek like he had done the first night I found him. His fingers were calloused but gentle. He smelled of pine and sweat and the kind of worry a person carries when the world grows rules around them. Emma and I stayed up late that night. We sat at the kitchen table with mugs of coffee that only barely warmed our hands and watched the radio for updates. She never left my side when things were sharp. She had the steady way of someone who needs to hold a lamp when it is windy.
Sometimes she would whisper what she thought was likely, and I'd nod. She told me to be careful with the sheriff and to not say too much to Webb. She told me not to trust the cameras more than the people who held them, and she told me, finally, that whatever we did was the right thing for Scout. Her voice was a rope. The next day, the team came with their official-looking papers and enough men to make the yard feel too public. They had dogs trained to find things, not the kind you take home for loafing after dinner, but dogs that could work a scent like a map. The sheriff read the warrant aloud as if he were turning the pages of a book we'd all agreed to somewhere in a different life. The air was brittle. The trees waited. The men in the team were polite. Dr. Webb was precise. He asked me again quietly whether there was anything of note in the barn. I could have talked myself into explaining everything up to the rafters, or I could have watched the ladder like a border a child might cross. I chose silence. We had 12 hours, then fewer. The presence of men with clipboards makes a place feel discovered even before their boots cross its soil. The cameras they left on the ridge picked up a shape on the edge of a late afternoon, something that moved with a dignity I had not thought to call graceful in those woods. They filmed it for a second, and then the light dropped. The clip later would be edited and discussed and turned into 10 takes with commentary. At the moment, it was a blur of fur and branches and the sound of their own breath. Emma and I talked in quick sentences then, each one a small plan. It is strange to have to be practical about something that feels larger than practicality allows. We decided that if the search came for the loft, Scout would not be there. We rehearsed the idea the way fishermen practice knots, methodically and without sentimentality. We didn't rehearse goodbyes. We rehearsed a leaving. Scout would go with Sage. Scout would go into the deep with the people who knew his shape best. We kept saying the word safe like it was a prayer. Scout seemed to understand that things were changing. He watched me patch a seam on the loft and then put his hand on the tool I was using like a small benediction. He asked me if I would be all right. Questions like that cut open the part of you that has been armored by years of keeping quiet. I told him I would be. The truth I couldn't say then, one I still carry with me, is that I feared the world he would meet if they ever decided the world should meet him. That fear was a reason, and it was, in its own way, a kind of love. The night before the search, the town seemed to hush its noise, as if listening along with me. The inn's neon sign blinked on and off like a watchful eye. A woman stopped on her way home to hand me a thermos of soup, and in a hushed voice told me to be careful about strangers. They walked through and catalogued and photographed, and then asked me a dozen of the same questions people always do when something is missing. I told them everything I could, without betraying what could not be given. Dr. Webb stood at the base of the ladder, and for a second looked up into the loft like a man who has seen a book left open on the table and wants to read the pages. He did not scold. He only took notes. He asked if I had a sense where the creatures went. "To the woods," I said. It's an answer that is both obvious and inadequate. After they left that night, with their cameras rolling and their notebooks folded, the world leaned in.
Someone posted a clip on a social site with a caption that read, "Strange biped caught on Ridge 12." The clip went small viral and then bigger. It was the kind of thing that churns up 1,000 small opinions. News teams called the sheriff. Tabloid outlets called with brighter, more sensational tones. Men and women who spoke as if they had always been on the right side of truth signed up for debates on talk shows and in internet comment threads. I could feel a kind of pressure build that made the inside of my ribs ache. There were investigators who came claiming affiliation and then left with the smell of disappointment on their breath. A private collector called. He was discreet and priced his words like a ledger and offered me something like compensation if I would point where to look. They always used the word compensation as if the problem could be turned into a service. I hung up the phone and sat with my back against the wall. It felt obscene to think about money in that moment. I thought of Scout's hands on my cheek, and I thought of the smell of the loft floor. There are things you will not sell, no matter how tempting the offer. Months folded into one another after the search. The media came and then drifted away like migrating birds. Scientists, real ones with degrees and patient voices, came and took meticulous notes and made conjectures on their pages. I answered what I could, where the barn sat on the grid, what trees grew at what intervals, the feed schedules. They were kind and precise. They asked for samples. They spoke of tickets and permits and the ethics of interfering with a potentially wild population. They had questions I could not always answer. They wore boots that had never bent to fix a rafter. There was a strange period, late winter into spring, when the world seemed to hold its breath. The viral clip had been analyzed and discussed, and while many wanted to be sure of conclusions, evidence did not immediately point to anything that would remove the need for caution. Some months passed with the forest quiet and the media hungry for the next soundbite. Emma and I kept our routines. I repaired a neighbor's gate. She baked bread for the woman down the road, and once a week we'd set out a small basket of apples on the stoop, hoping the other moons in the woods would be satisfied.
Our lives resumed a rhythm, but one threaded through with a different color. The hardest part of those months was not the cameras or the men with clipboards. It was the waiting. You spend 10 years keeping a secret, and you don't discover that the waiting is the part that eats you up. You count the days and then the months, and each one becomes a quiet test. I would walk the boundary at dusk and sometimes call Scout's name into the trees, the way a person might sing to a far relative. The trees answered with their private noises. Sometimes, for a breath, I thought I heard a reply, like the drag of a foot, and then only the sound of branches. There was one day in March of the following year when I stepped out on my porch and found a stone sitting on the step. It was a smooth gray thing, polished by thumb or river or some patient passage of life. It was the size of a lemon and warmed by the sun as if it had held the day. For a second I thought it was someone else's kindness, dropped off by a neighbor. Then I remembered the stone Sage had left when she first came into the yard the autumn before. I put my hand on it and felt the small ridges, like a braille the woods had written. I picked it up and, without meaning to, pressed it to my chest. People will ask later whether that stone was proof, whether it was a signal, whether it was evidence. It was none of those things in the way they want proof to be. Nobody called me with test results. Nobody knocked on my door with a certificate. The stone was a sign. That's a softer word than proof, but sometimes it is the sign that carries the weight. It was a quiet emissary from a life that had decided to keep moving without me in the center of it. When I put it in my palm, something in my chest rearranged into a gentler kind of duty. I understood, finally and with a sharp and grateful ache, that my role had changed and that the world had not left me bereft, but had instead rewritten what it expected of me. There were rumors, of course. Towns are good at making stories where there are blanks.
Some whispered that I had been paid and had run, stories that made dramatic fodder fritter in the mouths of people who did not know the weight of keeping things. Others said I had wandered off in guilt. Some said I'd been bought with a check and had left because I'd been offered a life away from trouble. They liked the tidy versions. The truth is messier. I had been offered things, sometimes in cash, sometimes in favors, sometimes in the quiet offers of men who thought they could buy the world back into order. I took offers in bread and tools and things that keep a life going. Someone filled my propane tank when I couldn't afford it. A neighbor fixed my fence and said no charge. Those are all forms of payment, and they are not dishonest. But I never took a sum large enough to be worth the betrayal of a child. I never took a sum that would make me forget Scout's hands on my cheek.
The years after that moved slow in a way that lets you feel the texture of every day. The clip on the ridge became a mystery that other people solved with other people's tools. Teams came back sometimes, usually polite and careful, and sometimes not. Dr. Webb wrote a paper that was careful in its language, claims stated as tentative, language chosen to make the difference between suggestion and certainty clean. He spoke on a panel and called it an anomalous sighting. He called me once on the phone and thanked me for my cooperation and for my discretion. I told him simply that discretion was a currency I understood. Scout's absence had a way of finding places in the house you forgot were occupied. His hat hung on a peg I passed every morning, and every time I went to work I would find it there, like a small hand on my shoulder. Sometimes in the evenings I'd go up the ladder and sit on the edge of the loft and look at the floor where he had read by lamplight. The smell of that place wore on me like a coat I couldn't take off. I'd sometimes tell myself that Sage had simply taken him deeper, that they were living the life of the forest the way the trees do, slow and indifferent to our calendars. That thought steadied me. Once, in a late summer that came 3 years after the day I found him, Scout walked into the clearing like he had always belonged there. He had a small child pressed to his side, one of his own perhaps, and when he smiled I saw the exact curl of his mother's mouth. He stayed at the edge of the yard only briefly, as if testing the idea of visiting, and then he vanished back into the dark with the same soft ease he'd used when he left all those years past. He left another stone on my step that morning, smaller than the last one, and when I picked it up, I felt my chest fold into a shape I recognized as gratitude. People asked if I was lonely. Yes, I was sometimes, but there was also a strange fullness to this kind of watching. My life had moved from being a central actor in a child's upbringing to a kind of sentry, a person who keeps a porch light on and waits. It is not a small thing to be trusted in that way, and not a small thing to be asked to accept that trust without making it into ownership. I would not trade the years I had with Scout for anything. I would not swap the nights he sat at my table and ate beans for the price of an easier conscience. That would have been a poor trade. There were moments of sharp pain, too. Once a documentary called and wanted to do an episode. They wanted interviews and footage and the kind of access that would have turned our quiet into a show. Emma and I talked it over and refused. It would have been legal. There were no laws saying I couldn't sell my story. But there are things that are legal and still wrong. Turning a life that had been raised in secret into fodder was the kind of betrayal I could not stomach. We said no. The producers moved on. Sheriff Tom and I kept an arrangement of sorts.
He dropped by from time to time with trivialities, an extra coat if I forgot mine, or to let me know of bears in the next valley, and I watched the way his face softened when I talked about the way the barn floor would creak in certain weather. He knew the truth, perhaps, in ways he could never speak. He protected us, not because of a badge, but because he understood what it was to be part of a town that harbors more than it tells.
Sometimes the town would give a sign of its opinion in quieter ways. A neighbor left a jar of preserves on my step during winter without a note. The grocery man would sometimes slip in a coupon for bulk feed. These were not payments in the formal sense. They were community currencies that say, without words, we know, and we will not let you be punished for that knowing. I cannot tell you all the things that happened with the same certitude I tell other things, because part of the beauty of secrecy is its thin, impossible function. The world arranges to protect what it wants to keep hidden sometimes, and sometimes it doesn't. I am grateful that for the most part my town chose the first option. There was one thing, in the end, that steadied me more than anything else, the idea that I had acted in good conscience. I had made choices that were messy and brave and confounding. I had failed and I had succeeded, and the ledger of those years was uneven. But I knew with the kind of clarity that only comes out of years of doing a thing, that the rightest thing I ever did was step forward and give the creature, the child who had wandered into my life, an ordinary human life for a portion of his days. Whether the world deemed that legal or scientific or proper is not the measure of the deed. When people asked me if I ever regretted hiding Scout, I often said no. That is not entirely true. I regret the nights I was afraid and did not act sooner in ways that might have eased some parts of his life. I regret the times I let fear make me small. I regret, sometimes, the way the town's curiosity turned the woods into a theater. But I do not regret the mornings he handed me a mug that I'd left cold and said, "Good morning, Stan," in his patchwork English. I do not regret teaching him to plane wood and watching him laugh when he did it wrong. Those things were payment in a form that never interested bank tellers. In the years since, I have kept the porch light on, and I have left little things on the step, a half apple, an extra woolen glove when winter comes. They are gestures, not bribes. They are small prayers. Once, when a reporter wrote a piece that tried to give my story a tidy ending, I sent her a letter asking that she respect the privacy of the creature and the family that kept to the forest. She published a different piece, one that focused on the hazards of sensational journalism. It was not exactly what I wanted, but it was better than nothing.
People will ask you, if you tell them this story, which one of you changed and which stayed the same. The answer is both. We all change when we love the things we are not supposed to. I changed by becoming someone who could protect a secret without expecting to be lauded for it. Scout changed by carrying his forest into towns and then taking it back out again. Sage changed in ways I could only guess. She was a mother who had been separated and then found again, and that makes even the hardest heart softer. There are moments I still replay in my mind. The first night I found him, the way he tucked his head into me to find the beat of my heart. The day the flyer arrived, the way the mother looked at me and folded my years like an old coat. The night he walked into the trees with a pack on his shoulder. I keep them not as trophies, but as parts of a life that was, like any other, messy and full of grace. The headline that said I'd been paid to hide a baby Bigfoot will never be entirely true, not in the way people who make headlines want it to be. It is true in the way my pockets were sometimes filled with kindness, and true in the way my life was compensated by the love that came back multiplied. It is true, too, in that when the mother returned, my place as Scout's central guardian disappeared in the sense that the title suggests. My role in his daily life changed and receded, as if I had been asked to step off a stage so the family could be together. I did not vanish from the world. Rather, I accepted a quieter role, the one of a sentinel and a friend.
If there's anything to say to you now, after all those years of listening and of keeping a porch light on, it's this. Secrets have weight, but love can be the thing that pays for keeping them. I cannot promise you that the world will be kind to the things it does not understand, nor can I promise that people will always choose protection over spectacle. What I can promise is that caring for something not of your own kind changes you in the most human ways. It teaches you patience. It teaches you sacrifice. It teaches you to measure risk not by the size of your fear, but by the size of what you love. If this story moved you, there are other first-person accounts like it, strange, small, and human, told by people who were there and who chose to speak plainly. Check the description for sources and photo context if you want to go deeper. For me, the loft ladder creaks in late summer heat the way it always did, and sometimes, if the night is calm enough, I swear I can hear a laugh in the trees that belongs to a boy who learned how to plane wood and then taught his own child to hold a rasp the right way. I keep a stone on my table and an extra bowl in the cupboard. I keep watch because that is my payment now. Not a check, not a contract, but the quiet labor of care. And that has been, in its own stubborn way, more than enough.